into the mid-1800s, there weren't very many people living here in the land of Israel, neither Arabs nor Jews. There was a small group of Arabs, and there was a small group of mostly elderly, ultra-religious Jews that were living in Jerusalem praying. When the Jews started to return to Israel in 1881, there were several waves of immigrants. Most of those waves going all the way up into the First World War were mostly Europeans, liberal Europeans, secular Europeans. They were first the high-class Europeans, the Western Europeans like Herzl, and then you had the Russian, the communist Jews coming in, and they built this land here, going all the way up to the time of World War II. At that time, most of the population in this land was secular. The religious community was growing little by little, continued to grow, but it was not a massive element. So therefore, the foundations of this country were laid on the British Mandate organization that was here, and then taken over by these waves of Jewish immigrants. So the vision from Herzl to Ben-Gurion and all this was that this would be a modern Israel, yes, a state for Jews, but it would be like France, it would be like Britain, it would be like Germany, it would be a wonderful utopian Israelite state. Well, that got kind of thrown around in the Holocaust. They weren't really expecting the Holocaust in the degree that it came. But after the Holocaust, of course, you had an immediate flood of immigrants that came into this country. A large number of them were immigrants from Eastern Europe who were ultra-Orthodox Jews, Yiddish-speaking, like my great-grandparents and grandparents with that generation, black coats, Yiddish-speaking, ultra-Orthodox, fleeing from the Holocaust of Europe. They didn't speak Hebrew. They didn't have any means of finance. They didn't have really any means of adjusting with modern culture, and they arrived on the shores of this country. And they became a kind of a strange implant here in the country. The people that founded the country actually thought, just give them a few years, they'll go into the army, and they'll become these modern, secular, European-type Israelis. That's what the hope was. But then after that, a few years later, just in the early 50s, then there began to be persecution of the Sephardic Jews, the Jews that lived in the Middle Eastern country, the Arab countries, and they began to flee. And they were much more religious. Even the ones who weren't ultra-religious, they still came from a religious background. And so you had this huge number that now you have from the 1950s of these new immigrants who were all basically penniless on both sides living here. And there was a process of some of them, many of them beginning to kind of assimilate into the general population. But there was another sense in which these religious communities began to form their own cells and close off their societies and live an ultra-Orthodox Jewish life. I don't think people really expected that happened. Now, from the 1950s, there began a development of this community. And there's actually several parts of it. Of the community, I would say, to oversimplify it, three different parts. There's the ultra-Orthodox Sephardic Jews, the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews, and then what is called the nationalistic Jews, who were more right-wing and political to start with. Now, this group of people who didn't have much of a political or economic base going back to the 1950s, their worldview was actually anti-Israel, because they looked at these atheist, secular Israelis that founded the country, and they believed that the country, the restoration of the country, was something that the Messiah would do. For them, it was almost like an antichrist movement, if you can understand it that way. But there was a very famous rabbi, perhaps the most influential rabbi in modern history, called Yitzhak Cohen, and he was Cohen Kook, and he was the first head rabbi of Israel, and he came up with a different idea. He said, no, that the secular state of Israel is the first stage. It's the beginning of the redemption, and then the country will turn into more of a religious country, and therefore the ultra-Orthodox Jews, we should not separate ourselves from them, but we should get involved in that, and the sort of the mixture of the secular Jews and the Orthodox Jews would eventually emerge into a whole nother stage, which would then lead to the coming of the Messiah. Now, I don't know if you could follow all that, but for those who live in a religious Jewish world in Israel, those thoughts are ABC basic. They all agree with that. Now that started from the 1950s, a set of developments that have continued steadily into this year. This past year, 6 months ago at this last election, everything changed. Now nothing changed because of a different direction, and nothing actually changed because of a leap forward. It just changed because they were progressively growing, and it crossed a line, and all of a sudden everything looked different. Well, let me explain to you what that difference was. Well, one difference is, for all of these religious communities, is that they were growing in numbers. They're growing in numbers. The secular community, particularly in the last 20 years, the reproductive rate is going down to less than 2 per family. Actually, a lot less than 2 per family. So the number of the general Israelis, if you don't count immigration, that number is basically, in terms of family growth, is going down. While the ultra-Orthodox community, they're having 8, 9 per average kids per family. So that number has just been increasing. And nobody really has sort of paid attention to that too much, but that's been happening. The second thing is that they've become more and more involved with the general community in Israel. They're still separatists, but separates with an area of involvement. That involvement, the next level, is that involvement has become more and more political. At first they were anti-Zionist. And then they got to be neutral about Zionism and became lightly political, but not really on one side, but they become more and more political over the years. One of their reasons for that is they realized if they became more political, they could get money from the government to finance their religious institutions, particularly the yeshivas, to have the young people studying. So the numbers have grown, the political involvement has grown. The next development in that is that political development has grown steadily more and more right-wing. People don't realize this, but when the ultra-Orthodox were originally involved in the political scene in Israel, they weren't necessarily right-wing. They basically said, we'll go with every government. They tried to be sort of neutral. But over the years, they've grown a little more and more right-wing in their worldview, so that today they're actually more right-wing than the Likud. I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, with that right-wing, there's also been another development, has been what we've called the nationalist Jews. The nationalist Jews are ones who wear a knitted kippah, who are more active, more modern, but are more openly aggressive politically and have a stance, a clear right-wing nationalist viewpoint, and they have been sort of a natural partner to the Likud party. The Likud party was the one, of course, from that Netanyahu has been leading. It goes back, of course, to Menachem Begin, and people don't realize it, but that party has been the primary party in control of the government most of the years since 1979 when they first run the election. Now that's gone up and down, but most of the years that party, the Likud party, has been the leading party. And their natural partner was, as kind of, I would say, like a little brother, has been these ultra-Orthodox, nationalist, ultra-right-wing, sort of militant Jews, and they were, but they were almost, I don't want to say cute. I don't want to lower it. I'm just saying they were like a younger brother that nobody was really bothered by. For the Likud, it was just adding enough numbers to them to give them enough numbers in their coalition so that they could lead the government. But really, the position of the ultra-right-wing nationalist Jews is not really the same philosophical, political viewpoint of what has been the Likud. Now, the Likud, of course, was first led by Menachem Begin, but over these past 2 decades particularly, has been led by Netanyahu. Now, Netanyahu his family comes from a religious background. He himself is not ultra-religious himself. He, like many, respects and is in favor of ultra-Orthodox Judaism, but that's not his viewpoint. He is a classic Likud, moderate right-wing government. But in order to form his government, he's always had to use both the ultra-Orthodox Jews and the right-wing Orthodox Jews the more nationalist one to be part of his party. Well, all this has happened, and it's been growing and growing and growing. The numbers of those people have been growing. So what happened in this past election was that those three parties, the ultra-right-wing nationalist Jews, which some people think of them as being settlers, but they're not just the settlers, they're much wider than that, and the Sephardic Jews and the Ashkenazic Jews, those numbers have been growing, and you also have to realize if their rabbis tell them to go out and vote for somebody, they'll go out and vote for them 99%. They'll all show up. So it's an incredibly strong element. And there's a group of those people that are also within the Likud party. So in this last election, between those three ultra-Orthodox religious parties and those ultra-Orthodox Jews within the Likud party really have a majority of the coalition. But a majority of those 64 are actually religious Jews. Now this is the big change here, because when people say that this is a clash about democracy, it really isn't, because these people have the largest block. I mean, they say, well, it's really not democracy. We're talking about democratic values, which is, what is democratic values? It means there has to be a balance of powers, which is why I'm sitting right here between the Knesset and the Supreme Court. But even the balance of powers is secondary to what is the value system that you're basing the balance of powers on. So it's not even that. Even the issues of the reform or what's going on, or the, if you want to call it an overthrow of the justice system. Either way, that's not really the issue. We'll take another session to go over each of the laws of reform.